On the 20th of February 2016, a quiet legal agreement in Sheffield marked the end of an era. Thomas Meldrum Limited, a company that had equipped British mechanics for 95 years, officially ceased trading in its historic form. The old corporate entity was closed. The operation that once forged the backbone of British automotive repair was forced to drastically restructure just to survive. A few decades earlier, that same name, stamped into a blackened, hardened steel tubular box spanner, meant absolute dominance. It was the unquestioned standard in every garage, shipyard, and ironmonger across the country, trusted to break loose the most stubbornly seized nuts on British machinery. But the real story of Melco in Britain is not merely about a corporate closure in 2016. It is the story of how an entire nation abandoned an indestructible, flawlessly simple Sheffield tool in favor of imported ratchet sets. It is the story of how the British retail market discarded the very steel that built it. Every week, we tell the stories of the tools, factories, and workshops that forged British industry and the market forces that ultimately broke them. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in the industrial heart of Sheffield in 1921. In the early months of 1921, the industrial atmosphere of Sheffield was thick with the soot of a massive post-war transition. The city, which had spent the previous 4 years churning out millions of tons of munitions, armor plating, and trench equipment, was desperately retooling for peacetime commerce. The vast drop forges and grinding wheels that had made Sheffield the undisputed capital of British steel were looking for new markets. While the older aristocratic firms of the city returned to their traditional exports of fine cutlery, edge tools, and heavy engineering castings, a different kind of industry was quietly taking shape in the smaller workshops scattered among the terraced streets. It was in this environment that Thomas Meldrum Limited was established. Unlike the ancient steel barons of the city, Thomas Meldrum did not set out to build towering steam hammers or forge massive ship crankshafts. The company focused its attention on a distinctly modern phenomenon that was just beginning to reshape the British landscape: the motor car and the rapidly growing network of independent garages, tire bays, and repair shops required to keep them running. To understand why a company like Thomas Meldrum was necessary, one must look at the physical reality of a British workshop in the early 1920s. Before the widespread standardization of the automotive industry, working on an early motor car, a commercial lorry, or a stationary agricultural engine was a harsh, physical battle. Fasteners were heavy, cast iron was brittle, and most importantly, the design of internal combustion engines was changing. In the pioneering days of steam and early mechanization, nuts and bolts were usually mounted on the exterior of a machine. A mechanic could easily reach them with a standard open-ended spanner, a heavy, flat hand tool with a U-shaped opening designed to slide onto two sides of a fastener. But by the early 1920s, as companies like Austin and Morris began producing more compact, complex, and tightly packaged engines, the geography of the machine shifted. Spark plugs were suddenly sunk deep into the recesses of cast iron cylinder heads. Wheel hub nuts were hidden behind heavy steel flanges. Engine mounting bolts were buried at the bottom of narrow, greasy shafts, where no flat spanner could ever hope to swing. For the British mechanic earning perhaps 3 or 4 pounds a week, these recessed fasteners were a daily nightmare. If a nut was buried deep inside a casing, an open-ended spanner was entirely useless. A ring spanner, a tool with a closed loop that surrounds the fastener, might grip the nut, but it could not reach down a narrow hole. The only alternatives were either to completely dismantle the surrounding engine block just to reach one bolt, or to attempt to turn the fastener with improvised, poorly fitting tools. Every seized spark plug cost a mechanic hours of fighting. Every rounded nut meant a drilled-out stud. Every cracked casting resulted in ruined work and lost wages. The British motor trade was accelerating, but the mechanic's toolbox was fundamentally trapped in the 19th century. The market desperately needed a tool that offered extreme reach, high torque, and a narrow profile. American toolmakers were just beginning to experiment with highly expensive, multi-part socket and ratchet sets, but for the average British garage worker or independent ironmonger, these imported kits were prohibitively costly and overly complex. Thomas Meldrum saw this exact mechanical absence. The answer the company provided was not a complicated mechanism. It was a masterpiece of Sheffield simplicity. The tubular box spanner. A box spanner is, in its purest form, a hollow cylinder of steel. The ends of the tube are pressed and formed into precise hexagonal shapes that perfectly map the contours of a nut or bolt. Because the tool is hollow, it can be slipped completely over long, protruding threads. Because the walls of the tube are relatively thin, it can slide effortlessly into the tightest, most heavily recessed engine cavities. To turn it, the mechanic did not need a heavy geared ratchet. Thomas Meldrum simply drilled a pair of holes straight through the body of the tube. The worker would take a Tommy bar, a solid, hardened steel rod, slip it through the holes, and use it as a T-handle to apply immense twisting force. It was a tool with 0 moving parts, 0 gears to strip, and 0 delicate mechanisms to fail in a dirt floor garage. When Thomas Meldrum Limited began manufacturing these tools under the brand name Melco, they did not target high-end luxury showrooms. They aimed squarely at the working hands of Britain. Records from early trade catalogs suggest that a basic set of Melco double-ended box spanners could be purchased for just a few shillings. This pricing strategy was a structural revelation. Suddenly, an apprentice mechanic did not need to save a month's wages to afford a complex socket set. He could buy a set of Melco tubes and a couple of Tommy bars and instantly service almost any vehicle that rolled into the tire bay. The early reception in the British market was swift and definitive. Independent ironmongers, the local hardware merchants who supplied the nation's tradesmen, embraced the Melco line because the tools were highly profitable, indestructible, and took up minimal space on a shelf. The brand quickly expanded its distribution through motor accessory wholesalers in Birmingham, Manchester, and London. Melco tools were rarely highly polished or given expensive decorative finishes. Instead, they were typically chemically blackened or finished in a tough stove enamel. This dark, utilitarian coating was highly resistant to the damp air of a Yorkshire winter and the corrosive oil of a workshop floor. The name Melco was stamped firmly into the side of the steel tube, a permanent signature of Sheffield origin. By the end of the 1920s, the Melco box spanner had crossed the threshold from being a novel automotive accessory to an unquestioned workshop standard. It was adopted by plumbers, who used long box spanners to reach tap connectors behind porcelain sinks. It was adopted by electricians, who used them to tighten fixtures inside narrow conduit boxes. It was adopted by aviation mechanics, who required lightweight tools that could not easily slip and damage delicate aircraft aluminium. The British absence had been filled. Before Melco, a recessed nut was a mechanical barrier that cost hours of labor. After Melco, it was simply a matter of selecting the right blackened steel tube, sliding the Tommy bar through the crossholes, and letting the leverage do the work. The company had successfully married the metallurgical heritage of Sheffield with the rapid expansion of the British motor trade. They had built a tool that asked for nothing and survived everything. And as the British automotive industry prepared for a mid-century explosion of mass production, Thomas Meldrum Limited was perfectly positioned to place a Melco spanner into the hands of every driver in the country. To understand how a hollow steel cylinder conquered the British mechanical trades, one must look closely at the physical reality of the tool itself. The breakthrough product was the Melco tubular box spanner, a hand tool consisting of a hollow, elongated cylinder of steel with hexagonal profiles formed at both ends to perfectly grip a fastener, turned by inserting a separate solid rod through cross-drilled holes. It was an exercise in absolute, brutalist simplicity. But in the oily, cramped confines of a mid-century British engine bay, that simplicity translated into an overwhelming mechanical advantage. By the 1930s, the concept of turning a nut from above was not entirely new. American toolmakers had begun exporting heavy, complex socket sets to Britain. A socket, a removable metal cup that fits over a fastener and connects to a separate handle or driver, was a highly effective system. A ratchet, a handle with a one-way mechanism that turns a socket without needing to be removed from the fastener after each turn, offered undeniable speed. But early sockets had a fatal flaw in the context of British engineering: wall thickness. Because early alloy steels were prone to cracking under extreme torque, manufacturers compensated by casting or machining the socket walls incredibly thick. When a British mechanic tried to fit an imported, thick-walled socket into the deeply recessed spark plug well of a Morris 8 or an Austin 7, the tool would simply jam against the cast-iron cylinder head before it ever reached the nut. Melco solved the clearance problem by fundamentally rethinking the geometry of the tool. Because the box spanner was formed from drawn Sheffield steel tubing rather than cast or heavily machined solid bar, its walls were exceptionally thin. Yet, because the grain of the steel ran continuously along the length of the unbroken tube, it possessed immense torsional strength. It could slide down the narrowest engine channel, slip over a deeply buried spark plug or a protruding stud, and grip the flats of the nut securely. When the mechanic slid a Tommy bar, a solid hardened steel leverage rod, through the crossholes, they created a massive T-handle. There were no ratcheting teeth to shear off under pressure. There was no square drive connection to snap. When confronted with a severely rusted fastener, a mechanic could slip a longer pipe over the Tommy bar, applying hundreds of foot-pounds of torque. The fastener would yield, or the bolt would shear, but the Melco tube would not split. This mechanical superiority was matched by a devastating economic reality. In the late 1930s, a comprehensive imported American socket and ratchet set could cost upwards of £4 or £5. For a British garage mechanic earning perhaps £3 a week, such a kit was a monumental, often impossible investment. In stark contrast, a single Melco box spanner covering the most common standard automotive sizes could be purchased over the counter at a local ironmonger for roughly 1 shilling and 6pence. A full set wrapped in a canvas roll cost a fraction of a mechanic's weekly wage. A broken tool was a disaster that halted work. A cheap tool that broke easily was a false economy. Melco provided the ultimate paradox for the British worker. A premium-grade Sheffield tool priced at the bottom of the retail market. This unique intersection of extreme durability, slim profile, and absolute affordability triggered a massive distribution breakthrough. The tool rapidly escaped the confines of the automotive garage and infiltrated the wider British industrial landscape. Local plumbers adopted the long-reach Melco tubes specifically to tighten back nuts. The hidden, hard-to-reach threaded fasteners securing brass taps to the undersides of deep porcelain sinks, where no traditional open-ended wrench could swing. Agricultural mechanics carrying out field repairs on Ferguson tractors relied on them because a box spanner could be dropped in the mud, wiped off, and used instantly without fear of grit ruining a delicate ratcheting mechanism. The ultimate institutional endorsement arrived with the outbreak of the Second World War. The British military and the Ministry of Supply required tools that were cheap to manufacture, required minimal raw materials, and could survive the appalling conditions of frontline mechanics. Melco box spanners became a standard issue component. Fitters in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the REME, used them to service the cramped engine bays of Bedford transport trucks. Shipyard workers on the River Clyde utilized heavy-duty versions to reach deeply recessed flange bolts on marine diesel engines. Municipal bus depots in Birmingham stockpiled them for heavy fleet maintenance. The tool had proven itself from the greasy floors of independent tire bays to the nationalized repair depots of the wartime state. The moat that protected Thomas Meldrum, limited during this era, was not a complex patent. Anyone could theoretically crush the end of a steel tube. The British moat was the manufacturing execution. It was the precise heat treatment, the controlled heating and cooling used to change the hardness and toughness of the steel, that prevented the hexagonal ends from rounding out under pressure. It was the deep, rust-resistant, stove-enameled black finish that survived decades of abuse. It was a distribution network that placed a Melco rack in nearly every independent hardware merchant and motor factor from London to Glasgow. By the time the British motor industry shifted into its post-war boom, the blackened tube was no longer just a clever alternative to an open-ended spanner. It had become the physical baseline of British mechanical work. The name stamped into the steel was not decoration. It was a specification. By the mid-1950s, the British industrial machine had transitioned from wartime survival to a sprawling, unprecedented peacetime boom. The nation was building, exporting, and above all, driving. The British motor industry, led by the vast assembly lines of Austin at Longbridge, Morris at Cowley, and the rugged engineering of Rover at Solihull, was producing vehicles at a staggering rate. And behind every new motor car, commercial lorry, and agricultural tractor rolling off those lines stood an expansive, grimy, highly skilled network of independent service garages tasked with keeping them running. In this post-war mechanical ecosystem, Thomas Meldrum Limited did not simply participate. It reigned. The blackened Sheffield tube had crossed the threshold from a useful specialty item to an invisible industrial necessity. To survey the professional British workshops of the 1950s and 1960s was to witness the absolute saturation of the Melco brand. Sheffield forged the reputation. Birmingham carried the trade. The Black Country cast the iron. But it was the working mechanics of Britain who turned the Melco box spanner into an institution. The vast British rail engineering workshops at Crewe and Swindon kept heavy-duty Melco spanners on their benches to service the hidden pipework of transition-era diesel locomotives. The shipyards of the River Clyde relied on their thin-walled strength to access recessed mountings on marine generators. Agricultural engineers in the rural shires carried them in the toolboxes of Massey Ferguson tractors. Municipal bus depots in London and Leeds stockpiled them by the dozen. Down at the high street level, every serious hardware merchant and independent ironmonger from the Scottish Highlands to the coast of Cornwall dedicated a specific section of their shelving to the distinctive, dark enameled steel tubes. The sheer scale of production at the Thomas Meldrum Works in Sheffield accelerated to meet a national demand that seemed entirely insatiable. While exact historical production logs from the era are incomplete, available reports indicate that at the peak of the British motoring boom, hundreds of thousands of Melco tubular box spanners and solid Tommy bars were being pressed, pierced, hardened, enameled, and shipped annually. The factory expanded its focus, securing its dominance by producing complementary lines of heavy-duty tire bay equipment, four-way wheel braces, and battery service tools. Yet the absolute core of the empire remained the hollow tube. This was not a tool confined to professional mechanics alone. As the 1960s approached, the British public embraced the concept of the weekend motorist. Cars like the original BMC Mini were brilliant, compact, and notoriously difficult to work on. The average British driver, facing the high costs of professional garage labor, increasingly turned to home maintenance. For these amateur mechanics, the Melco box spanner was a revelation. It was the only affordable tool capable of reaching the deeply recessed spark plugs of a transverse engine without requiring the removal of surrounding components. In the catalogs of major national distributors and the dusty window displays of corner auto factors, the pitch remained flawlessly consistent. The tool required no special maintenance. It had no ratcheting gears to jam with dirt. It could be thrown into the boot of a car, left in the damp for a decade, and still perform perfectly when an emergency required it. The brand had achieved the rarest of all industrial milestones. It had become the generic shorthand for the tool itself. Mechanics did not ask an apprentice for a tubular box spanner. They asked for the Melco. The empire also extended far beyond the shores of Britain. Through the established channels of the Commonwealth and the global reach of British automotive exports, crates of Thomas Meldrum tools were shipped to garages in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada. A Land Rover exported to the African savannah or a Morris Minor sent to a humid Asian outpost carried the exact same mechanical challenges as one navigating the streets of London, and the Sheffield solution was exported alongside them. The Made in England stamp pressed into the side of a Melco tube represented a global guarantee. It promised a mechanic on the other side of the world that the steel had been drawn and hardened in the same furnaces that had built the British industrial reputation. Yet, despite this international reach, the heart of the Melco operation remained fiercely local. The workforce in Sheffield understood intimately what they were manufacturing. They were not assembling delicate laboratory instruments. They were forging working-class leverage. The men and women operating the presses, manning the hardening ovens, and managing the chemical blacking baths were deeply embedded in the Sheffield tool-making tradition. They knew that the ultimate test of their labor would not take place on a pristine testing rig, but on a wet roadside in November, under the bonnet of a stalled car, by a driver with freezing hands and zero patience for a tool that might slip. For the British tradesman, the value of the tool was proved not in the showroom, but in the bleakest moments of mechanical failure, on a seized cylinder head nut deep inside the cast-iron block of a commercial Bedford lorry, parked in a freezing Leicestershire transport depot, where a cheap, loose-fitting spanner would slip round the flats and turn a 10-minute job into a ruined engine. The exact dimensional tolerance of a Melco tube meant the difference between finishing the repair and losing the vehicle for the day. The tool gripped. The solid Tommy bar might bend slightly under massive, desperate torque, but the Sheffield steel tube would not split. That reliability bred a fierce, generational loyalty. By the late 1960s, this loyalty was structurally reinforced by the British engineering education system. In technical colleges and city and guilds motor vehicle mechanic courses across Manchester, Leeds, and Coventry, instructors did not merely recommend the tubular box spanner, they mandated it. It was often the very first tool a young apprentice was expected to purchase with his own wages. A canvas tool roll filled with blackened Melco tubes was the physical proof that a boy was ready to work on the floor of a professional garage. In the thriving ecosystem of the British motor trade, major national automotive factors like Brown Brothers, along with vast networks of independent Lucas electrical agents, held massive standing orders for Thomas Meldrum products. When a new Ford Cortina, a Jaguar E-Type, or a Rover P5 was sold, the dealership's service bay relied on Sheffield steel to maintain it. The metrics of this golden era illustrate a company operating at the absolute limit of its capacity. While exact internal production logs from the John Street Works in Sheffield are incomplete, available reports suggest that at the peak of their distribution, Thomas Meldrum Limited was supplying thousands of distinct retail and wholesale outlets across the United Kingdom. The firm was not just supplying the automotive market. It was heavily embedded in the British motorcycle industry, providing the specialized thin-walled metric and Whitworth box spanners required to service the tightly clustered engine cooling fins of Triumph, BSA, and Norton motorcycles. It is estimated that at the height of the 1960s, tens of thousands of British mechanics interacted with a Melco product every single working day. To hold a Melco tubular box spanner at the height of its reign was to hold an object of perfect, unpretentious utility. Under the flickering fluorescent lights of a mid-century British garage, the blackened steel bore the honest scars of daily use. The stove-enameled finish would eventually wear thin around the hexagonal ends, polished back to bare, bright Sheffield steel by thousands of repeated contacts with hardened nuts. The stamped letters of the Melco name would fill with dark engine grease, making the brand stand out even more clearly against the metal. It felt substantial, balanced, and permanent. It was a tool that fathers confidently handed down to sons, knowing the steel would outlive them both. At this peak, Thomas Meldrum Limited appeared untouchable. They had captured the British workshop, dominated the independent ironmonger shelf, and secured a place in the boots of millions of private motor cars. The British toolmaking industry of the late 1960s still believed that superior domestic steel, simple design, and local manufacturing were an absolute defense against any market threat. The tool itself was virtually flawless, but a tool does not exist in a vacuum. It exists on a retail shelf, inside a supply chain, and against a constantly shifting technological landscape. The British mechanic was about to be offered a completely new way of working. The independent hardware merchants who had built the Melco empire were about to face a retail extinction event, and the indestructible Sheffield steel tube was about to collide with the crushing forces of globalized convenience. The collapse of a British tool empire rarely begins with a sudden, catastrophic failure of the product itself. In the case of Thomas Meldrum Limited and the Melco brand, the steel did not suddenly become weak. The manufacturing tolerances in the Sheffield works did not slip. A Melco tubular box spanner produced in 1975 was every bit as indestructible, precise, and reliable as one forged in 1955. But in the highly unforgiving arena of the British retail and industrial market, manufacturing consistency is not a defense against structural change. Beginning in the 1970s, the environment that had made the Melco spanner an absolute necessity began to fracture. The decline of this specific Sheffield empire was not driven by a single bad decision, but by the simultaneous arrival of three devastating British market forces: a profound technological shift in automotive repair, an unstoppable wave of cheap imports, and the rapid consolidation of the British retail landscape. The first and most fatal force was the technological and trade shift. For decades, Thomas Meldrum's absolute advantage had been clearance. The thin walls of their drawn steel tubes could reach recessed nuts that thick-walled cast sockets could not. But global metallurgy had not stood still. By the 1970s, foreign toolmakers, particularly in Japan and later Taiwan, had mastered the mass production of chrome vanadium steel, an alloy of steel mixed with chromium and vanadium that vastly increases tensile strength, hardness, and resistance to wear. This metallurgical advancement changed the geometry of the imported mechanics tool. Using chrome vanadium, foreign manufacturers could forge ratcheting socket sets with walls almost as thin as a Melco tube, yet capable of withstanding immense torque without shattering. Suddenly, the primary mechanical moat protecting the Sheffield box spanner was entirely neutralized. Simultaneously, the economic reality of the British garage floor was changing. As vehicle complexity increased and the broader British economy faced severe inflationary pressures, the metric of workshop success shifted from absolute durability to absolute speed. The flat-rate manual, an industry guide that dictated exactly how many minutes a mechanic could bill for a specific repair, became the ruling law of the service bay. Mechanics were increasingly under pressure to beat the clock. In this new, hyper-accelerated environment, the brilliant simplicity of the box spanner became a liability. To use a Melco tube, a mechanic had to seat the tool, locate the cross holes, slide the Tommy bar through, turn the fastener a quarter rotation, pull the bar out, reposition it, and turn again. It was brutally effective, but it was slow. A modern mechanic equipped with a fine-toothed ratcheting handle could remove the same bolt in a fraction of the time without ever lifting the tool off the fastener. Furthermore, the rise of the pneumatic impact wrench, a heavy powered tool driven by compressed air that delivers rapid, high-torque rotational strikes to loosen nuts instantly, fundamentally altered heavy repair work. Tire bays and municipal depots that had once bought thousands of heavy-duty Melco wheel braces and box spanners transitioned to air-powered guns. The blackened steel tube was entirely incompatible with this new, mechanized speed. It was relegated from being the primary tool of daily work to a specialty item, kept at the bottom of the toolbox only for emergencies. The second force to strike the Sheffield works was the flood of cheap imports and private labels. As the domestic British motor industry began its long, painful decline in the late 1970s and 1980s, the market for mechanics tools fragmented. While professional mechanics invested heavily in premium imported socket sets from American or high-end European brands, the lucrative amateur DIY market was captured by Asia. Massive multi-piece socket and ratchet kits, housed in brightly colored blow-molded plastic cases, began arriving at British ports. Brands like Kamasa, alongside countless unbranded imports, offered the British consumer a devastating value proposition. For the price of just half a dozen premium, single-purpose British hand tools, a weekend motorist could purchase an imported 50-piece set that appeared to cover every possible mechanical eventuality. The imported sockets were not necessarily forged to the same exacting tolerances as a Sheffield tube, and their ratchets often failed under heavy strain. But they were cheap, they were comprehensive, and they were shiny. This shift in consumer expectation fed directly into the third force: retail consolidation. The Melco empire had been built on the shelves of the independent British ironmonger and the local motor accessory shop. These shopkeepers understood the value of a stove-enameled Sheffield tool, but by the 1980s, these independent merchants were being rapidly driven out of business by national, out-of-town retail chains and massive DIY superstores. Chains like Halford's fundamentally redefined how automotive tools were sold in Britain. National buying offices did not want to deal with thousands of loose, blackened steel tubes that required knowledgeable staff to sell. They demanded standardized packaging, blister packs, barcodes, and high visual appeal. They demanded bright chrome plating that looked impressive under harsh fluorescent store lighting. The stove-enameled black finish of a Melco box spanner, a finish originally chosen because it resisted the damp and grease of a working garage better than cheap chrome, suddenly looked agricultural, old-fashioned, and dirty on a modern retail pegboard. The massive national chains began replacing British-made single tools with their own private label socket sets, manufactured offshore. The shelf space that Thomas Meldrum had held for half a century was silently handed over to overseas foundries. In Sheffield, the John Street Works continued to stamp, harden, and finish the tools exactly as they always had. But the catalogs of the major distributors began to thin out. Orders from the massive automotive factors shrank from thousands of units to hundreds. The tool had not failed the British market. The British market had simply evolved to prioritize speed, packaging, and unit cost over local, multi-generational durability. The trajectory of the company had irrevocably turned. As the British retail environment turned openly hostile to unbranded or traditionally finished hand tools, the physical reality of the British motor car was also changing in ways that actively punished the box spanner's design. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the automotive industry rapidly adopted the transverse engine layout, an engine mounted sideways between the front wheels, designed to maximize passenger cabin space while heavily restricting working room under the bonnet. In the engine bay of a 1960s Austin, a mechanic had ample vertical clearance to drop a long Melco tube over a spark plug, insert a solid Tommy bar, and swing the bar in a full circle in the tightly packed, heavily computerized engine bay of a modern Vauxhall Vectra or a Ford Mondeo. That vertical and horizontal space simply no longer existed. Plastic intake manifolds, complex wiring looms, and tight firewalls occupied every available inch. If a mechanic attempted to insert a Tommy bar into a box spanner, the bar would instantly strike a plastic housing before it could turn even a fraction of a degree. The mechanic was physically forced to use a low-profile ratcheting socket with a flexible head and a short extension. The absolute length and the T-handle leverage that had made the Melco tube so devastatingly effective in the mid-century workshop had suddenly become a physical impossibility. The tool had not lost its strength. The arena had simply shrunk. This spatial restriction was compounded by a fundamental shift in how the British motor trade operated. The golden era of the Melco empire was built on the vast network of independent garages, small, often grimy workshops where mechanics bought their own individual tools from local ironmongers and kept them for life. But as vehicles became rolling computers, independent garages struggled to keep up with the diagnostic technology required to service them. The market shifted toward massive, franchised dealership networks. Inside the clinical, brightly lit service bays of these new corporate dealerships, tools were often procured entirely differently. Dealerships purchased standardized, mandated toolkits supplied by major international brands or directly by the vehicle manufacturers. The diagnostic computer and the pneumatic airline replaced brute mechanical leverage. The young apprentice was no longer sent down the high street to buy a canvas roll of blackened Sheffield tubes. He was handed a blow-molded plastic case filled with imported fine-toothed ratchets. As the volume of automotive orders evaporated, Thomas Meldrum Limited attempted a managed retreat. They leaned heavily into the sectors where extreme clearance and brute durability still mattered. They continued to supply the plumbing trade, where long box spanners were still required to reach the back nuts of deep porcelain sinks. They maintained their specialized tire bay equipment lines. But the mass market, the millions of amateur motorists and independent mechanics who had once treated the brand as a universal standard, was gone. The John Street Works in Sheffield found itself stranded in a changing industrial landscape. The massive drop forges and stamping presses that had once run continuously to meet national demand were increasingly silent. The workforce naturally contracted. As older, highly skilled steel workers and enamelers retired, they were often not replaced. It was a slow, quiet attrition rather than a spectacular collapse. The company was caught in the classic British manufacturing paradox. They were making a product that lasted forever in a market that now survived on replacement and rapid turnover. It was mathematically impossible for a domestic Sheffield factory, paying British wages and adhering to British environmental regulations regarding steel treatment and chemical blacking, to compete on price with a Taiwanese foundry churning out million-piece socket sets for international DIY superstores. By the turn of the millennium, the name Melco had faded from the forefront of the British mechanical consciousness. It was no longer the generic shorthand for a spanner. To a new generation of mechanics raised on snap-on sockets and cordless impact drivers, the blackened tube looked like an archaeological relic. The grand national catalogs that had once dedicated pages to the brand either ceased printing entirely or replaced the line with cheap, unbranded imports. The final definitive fracture of the old empire arrived in the winter of 2016. After 95 years of continuous operation, navigating the Great Depression, the Second World War, the collapse of the British motor industry, and the rise of globalized retail, the original corporate structure could no longer be sustained. The market volume required to support the historic framework had finally run dry. On the 20th of February 2016, Thomas Meldrum Limited officially ceased trading as its original legal entity. It was an orderly closure, a legal restructuring designed to allow the surviving fragments of the brand to pivot and exist as a much smaller, highly specialized niche manufacturer under the new name Melco Products Limited. But the 1921 empire, the massive, dominant force that had armed every workshop in the country, was formally dismantled. The transition was absolute. The retail chains moved on. The independent ironmongers closed. The franchised bays modernized. The massive orders stopped. The original company ended. The old works went quiet. The market chose speed. The steel was left behind. The legal closure of Thomas Meldrum Limited in February 2016 did not mean the absolute erasure of the brand from the British landscape. The company was immediately resurrected and restructured under a new legal entity, Melco Products Limited. The name survived, but the empire did not. The new operation was forced to adapt to the modern reality of British manufacturing. It retreated entirely from the mass automotive market, focusing instead on highly specialized, lower-volume tools and bespoke tube-forming work. The days of dominating every independent ironmonger's shelf, of supplying every municipal bus depot, and outfitting thousands of local tire bays were permanently over. The company had secured its survival by accepting a fraction of its former footprint. But while the modern corporate entity adapted, the millions of original tools forged during the brand's mid-century golden age entered a different kind of afterlife. Today, across Britain, a vast and quiet preservation community maintains the old Sheffield steel. In the muddy fields of classic car auto jumbles at Beaulieu, at Sunday car boot sales in the Midlands, and on the digital pages of online auction sites, original Melco tubular box spanners are actively hunted. They are bought by vintage tool collectors, classic motorcycle restorers, and retired mechanics who remember exactly what a proper tool felt like in the hand. They do not buy them to display behind glass. They buy them to work. The original Melco spanner still matters in Britain today because, For certain specific mechanical tasks, it simply cannot be replaced by modern production. Consider a mechanic attempting to restore a 1960s Triumph Bonneville motorcycle, or working deep inside the cramped engine bay of an original Morris Minor. A modern, imported chrome vanadium socket, no matter how finely geared its ratchet mechanism might be, often has a shoulder that is simply too thick. It will jam against the cast aluminium cooling fins of the motorcycle cylinder head long before it reaches the spark plug. But an original, thin-walled Melco tube, drawn from properly hardened Sheffield steel and carrying the honest wear of 50 years, will slide perfectly into that narrow gap. It can still do what a loose, bulky, imported copy cannot: reach the fastener and grip it without destroying the surrounding metal. The tool is still used not out of blind nostalgia, but because the job still begins where steel meets steel. There is a surprising footnote to the Melco story that exists entirely outside the automotive world. Long after the modern franchised garages had discarded their box spanners in favor of pneumatic impact guns and flexible ratchets, generations of British plumbers quietly hoarded the long-reach Melco tubes. They kept them hidden in their vans, specifically for one maddening task: securing monoblock tap fittings behind the deep, inaccessible recesses of ceramic bathroom basins. In the dark, damp spaces beneath British sinks, where no ratcheting handle could ever swing, the simple Sheffield tube and a short Tommy bar remained the absolute pinnacle of functional design. The water trades kept the tool working long after the motor trade had moved on. To walk through the industrial districts of Sheffield today is to witness a profound physical transformation. The dense, interwoven network of drop forges, grinding hulls, and enameling shops that once supported operations like the John Street Works has largely been swept away. The soot, the heavy vibration of the stamping presses, and the sharp smell of chemical blacking baths have been replaced by the quiet hum of residential developments, student housing blocks, and light commercial units. The physical geography of the city remains, but the heavy industrial ecosystem that allowed a company to source its steel, form its tools, and finish its products all within a few square miles of city streets has vanished. The British story of Melco reveals a harsh, uncomfortable truth about how a nation exhausts and discards industrial excellence. It proves that a tool can be structurally flawless, highly affordable, and practically indestructible, yet still lose the market. The British workshop did not abandon the tubular box spanner because the Sheffield steel failed. They abandoned it because the broader retail system demanded shiny packaging, blister packs, and multi-piece sets that looked impressive under fluorescent lights. The industrial market shifted because the modern flat-rate economy demanded the speed of a ratcheting gear over the absolute generational reliability of a solid steel tube. The tools we choose to buy reflect what we value. When the British market allowed the ironmonger to be replaced by the out-of-town superstore and the repairable machine to be replaced by the sealed unit, it traded a culture of permanence for a culture of convenience. What was lost was not merely a blackened piece of steel. It was a way of working where repair was a serious, lifelong commitment rather than a disposable act. Yet, the steel outlives the system that discarded it. Somewhere right now, lying in the bottom drawer of a grease-stained toolbox in a cold Sheffield garage, an original tubular spanner rests. Its dark stove enamel is worn away at the edges, the stamped letters of its name polished smooth by 1,000 working hands, waiting for a stubborn nut, a solid bar, and one more turn. The tools we discard tell the story of the industry we lost. See you in the next one.